I'm going to screen share and start this virtual open house. Can I get just a thumbs up from my other panelists that the screen share is there and working? Thank you, everybody. So my name is Bill Valerio. I'm the director of Woodmere Art Museum, and this is a virtual open house. Now, museums are very social places, and there's nothing more exciting in the life of a museum than the opening celebration for a new exhibition. In these odd and challenging times that we're living in, so much of what we're doing, under the roof of the museum is moving online, and we've been using Zoom as an amazing tool to be able to continue education programs, but also sustain the social component of what the museum is about. So I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This is the virtual open house. This is the opening party for the exhibition that we open here at Woodmere on Saturday. Actually, 3 exhibitions, 2 exhibitions here at Woodmere, an exhibition also at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy, which are all gathered under the umbrella of the title Sam Feinstein, Group 55, and Midcentury Abstraction in Philadelphia. These are 3 exhibitions that take place in 2 places. And those 2 places I'm showing now, that is Woodmere on the right and Springside Chestnut Hill Academy on the left. I just want to say, in terms of some ground rules with Zoom, I fully understand that people are going to come in and go out in the course of the open house. We want this to be interactive, and so we ask if you have questions to put them in the Q&A stream. Hildy Tao, who's Woodmere's Director of Education, will be monitoring the questions, and when we get to the end, Hildy will consolidate questions. Sometimes, questions can be combined so that we can answer them in an efficient way. We'll probably be speaking for about 45 minutes, I would say, 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes, or as long as we need for Q&A. And we're just very grateful for you to be here. One of the really nice things about these exhibitions is that they are a collaboration between Woodmere and Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. It's not our first time doing a project together, but this is the first time that we've done an exhibition together, and it has been really wonderful because a museum and a school are both about opening the mind. So joining, bringing our resources and our creativity together has been a wonderful process. And with that, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Steve Druggan, who runs Springside Chestnut Hill Academy, and he's going to introduce himself and all the great work that school does. Steve.
Thanks, Bill. Bill, it's been too long since we've been able to share, break some bread together. So hopefully before too long, we can do that again. Yes, my honor to be here at SCH, Springside Chestnut Hill Academy, in our wonderful Crawford Gallery. And we were just discussing here in the room that this idea for this joint project started just about 2 years ago. And it wasn't the first project. And I actually want to share a little story about the first time I met Bill. It was my second day at work.
I'm in trouble now.
No, this is a good story, Bill. It was my second day at work at SCH. And Jane McHugh, our amazing development director, had organized the opportunity for me to have breakfast with institutional leaders in the neighborhood. And Bill was one of those. And it was the day that Bill was closing Germantown Avenue to move a very large piece of art from the center of Philadelphia to what is now sitting in front of the school, of the museum, the Batoya. And I was like, I think I like this guy. And Bill, in his sly self, after the end of our hour having breakfast, said, Steve, can we walk over to your library? And he said, let me tell you about this Violet Oakley you have. And by the way, can I borrow it? And I was naive and I was new and I wanted to play nice with my neighbors. And I said, sure. My CFO was not very happy with that, but that led to the Violet Oakley from the library being moved to Woodmere and on display when they did the incredible Life of Violet Oakley 2 years ago, Bill?
Yeah, well, it was 2017, if you can imagine. Yeah. So, wow.
And then they lent us, last year, we had an exhibit here in the Crawford Gallery of our permanent collection. And over the 150 plus years, Springside and CHA have developed a pretty substantial permanent collection. And Bill and the Woodmere were kind enough to lend the sketches of the Violet Oakley triptych that's in our library to us so that students were able to see the development from the sketches to the famous piece in the Henry Library at what was CHA, now SCH, in the Wissahickon Inn. So it's really been a pleasure. The other interesting piece that Bill did for me when he visited was he told me about all the heads of school portraits that line the hallways, and some of them have very interesting artists behind them. And Bill's able to enlighten me to some of those pieces. So it's been really a pleasure for me to work with Bill since I've arrived, since I've been at SCH. And as a family, we really find the Woodmere to be an incredible treasure for the community. And we love having our students go there, especially when the Pinckney exhibits are there, and any of those works are really just perfect for what we do at SCH. And as Bill said, passion, education, and art are such a core part of both our organizations. And we look forward to this being an incredible run for these 3 different exhibits taking place. So Bill, Woodmere, thank you for including us. Thank you to the team here that made it happen. Let's go forth.
Thank you, Steve, so very much. And part of what makes my job such a pleasure is that I do get to collaborate with people like you, and everybody on the staff here at Woodmere gets to collaborate with everyone at SCH. So it's a real pleasure. The last thing I'm going to say before moving on is I deliberately chose this particular photograph of Woodmere from last Saturday because that was our first experiment with jazz outside on Saturday. Our second jazz session is 1950s Philly jazz in association with Sam Feinstein and Group 55. And I hope that you will be so excited and inspired by this presentation that you're going to want to come and experience this concert this coming Saturday and come see the show while you're here for the jazz concert. And, I just wanted you to see it's bring your own blanket or bring your own lawn chair. And, it's, from our perception, from speaking to our visitors, a safe, fun experience. But a big part of what we do and a big part of what we're doing together with SCH is engaging with our community using the exhibition as a platform for deeper learning and experiences. And music is always a part of that. So very excited to be offering a jazz program on Saturday in connection with this exhibition. And I hope you'll be interested in coming. It's really fun. With that, I'd like to introduce my friend, Pat Feinstein, who is going to who's going to introduce herself and her relationship with her husband, Sam Feinstein, and talk about the 3 shows that are currently on view. Pat? I am not hearing Pat.
That would be why. Now you can, right?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I'm very excited that we are now having 3 shows about Sam's life, really taking into account all of his commitment. From a very early age, he felt that he was blessed with a kind of talent, a kind of ability, but he had honed it from the time he was a young man. He always drew. And he went to art school, and he wanted his life to be meaningful. He really nurtured that in anyone who came in contact with him, I think, to make a reasonable decision and choice about how to live a life. What is a meaningful life? And you see the different aspects of how that comes out in the 3 parts of this show. I was with him as a student initially, and a friend for many years. I was a friend with Barbara Crawford as well. And of course, it is the Barbara Crawford Gallery here. Sam taught for 4 or 5 years at Chestnut Hill from 1938 to 42. And then Barbara took over when he went into the Army. And she just never left. She was absolutely adored and has many students who gained so much from her. And then she brought many of those students to Sam to learn, because Sam taught privately in Philadelphia from 1952 until 2003. Teaching was a very important part of his life, and so education of all sorts. I taught with him actually for 18 years in a row, 4-day workshops, first in Michigan and then in Toronto, and that was one of the highlights of my life, really, working together with him and co-teaching and just making a kind of partnership out of that teaching experience with very large classes up in Toronto. So the shows we're seeing are the early years where he first was a student and he did wonderful illustrations, and he really honed his skills in every single level: watercolor, printing, oil painting. And so you have marvelous selection because Pia Drugan and Ellen Fishman and Melissa, who all worked on this art committee for Chestnut Hill, put together a show that is stellar. They have such an eye and such a dedication to quality in what they've done. And so I'm thrilled about this early show. And that really takes you right up to the time. He was actually teaching at the Philadelphia Museum of Art at one point. And head of the classes, and I think met many of the artists that he worked with in the 1950s at that time. He went on to study with Hans Hofmann, and his realm really grew at that point. He was in Provincetown in the summers. He was in New York, back and forth from New York to Philadelphia for the rest of his life. And he founded Group 55 after 3 years of writing about art. He was writing for Art Digest magazine, and he reviewed art and the Arensberg collection. And he wanted to convey the beauty of art and the importance of art. He absolutely believed in that, as did Hoffman. And they both had grown to the point of working with the real essence of the visual language: shapes and forms and gestures and colors and line that convey emotion, which of course through all history is the part that conveys the emotion of any picture, whether it's realistic or whether it's abstract or semi-abstract. So the Group 55 show brings together 20, 30 artists that he worked with, and he was friends with composer George Rochberg. I have letters. I have found all kinds of archival material that he left behind. And letters from George Rochberg, the composer, and Joe Castaldo, Vincent Persichetti. And we discovered this wonderful dancer, Malvina Taiz. In doing the research for this show, it was difficult at first to find anything about her, although she had taught at University of Pennsylvania. But we've finally discovered marvelous materials. You'll see some photos soon. And she worked on many panels that discuss different aspects of art and abstract art. And of course, the gestures of dancers is what conveys emotion also. So the Group 55 show features all of these paintings, all focused on abstraction from many women. I loved Doris Staffel, who was actually in charge of 2 of the forums that they held. She was the moderator for them. And she said, you really need to nurture a habit of being open to openness. And that's really what these artists were trying to do, is open up a stiffer realm and make it freer and bring each person to their own sense of what life was about and what the meaning was about. And so the Group 55 show fills the rotunda at Woodmere, beautiful show. And then Sam, after the 1950s, And he painted many, many paintings during that time, wonderful works of art. I think we have one of his pietas coming up, I think, and we show him teaching, right? Yeah, here he's gesturing. He may be gesturing, in fact, at one of the forums. He developed these forums and even taped them where he was trying to educate people to the public. You'll hear more about that from Barbara. And this is one of his works we know was shown in 1958. He did a series of 3 pietas, and his themes tended to be very serious at this point in time, but all different kinds of expression. So this is one of a series, and there's 2 of them that are in this show. One is in the permanent collection at the New Britain Museum of American Art up in New Britain, Connecticut. You see on the right, Sam in this photograph is gesturing. It may be at one of the forums because people brought their paintings together and talked about them in front of an audience. After the 1950s, when he was so active, writing, teaching, his teaching began in 52 in Philadelphia, and in New York, he inherited Hans Hofmann's classes. Hoffman stopped teaching in 58 and asked Sam if he would take over his classes. And he inherited about 17 students and kept teaching there as well. He had a loft there in New York at that time. And then he kept painting. But he stopped showing in about 1960. By then, abstract art was not receiving the publicity it had for a while. And he was involved with teaching, with a new home. Started going to Cape Cod, and that's where I met him when I first started studying painting with him after I had graduated from Mount Holyoke, and I was already a painter, but I started studying with Sam. And his classes were marvelous. He never advertised, but he taught for the rest of his life, and he painted. He painted huge paintings, and we have just a sampling of them, really, in this Immersive Abstraction show. He, by that time, had really learned the lessons of Hofmann, had understood the language, and was able to talk about how forms work, what happens, what does color do. And they both built out of what they called color forms as the essence. And he would quote Cezanne saying, "The form is at its fullest when color is in its plenitude." And he did use plenty of color, certainly. And he gradually saw that color is really an equivalent to light and energy. And he wrote about it and thought about it all the time. And he believed in what he would call plasticity, which is nature's inner drive and inner energy. And he tried to get that drive that's underneath the surface of things. He would use all kinds of metaphors to talk about that in his teaching. I think the one I like the best was the can of beans. He said, well, now there's the can of beans, and you see it, and it's got a label on the top. But what is the content? There's the subject matter. Subject matter is beans. What is the content? Well, the beans, of course. No, it's the nutrients. You don't even see them. But that's what is the real content. And that's what he aimed for when he was painting. He aimed for the essence, the real content, directly. There's one painting in the Immersive Abstraction shows, and it's called The Cry, and it's as if you're hearing the sound of the forms clashing together in the brilliance of their light. But it's the sound that's coming through. The colors, as he was making an equivalent from all different kinds of senses of being a human. So now that we have one more slide, and then I'm going to pass this back to Bill and on to Barbara, I believe. This is the Barbara Crawford Gallery back at Chestnut Hill, and the Immersive Abstraction show I think Bill's going to talk about later, right?
Pat, thank you so much. Yes, I will speak about the Immersive Abstraction show, but first, we're going to hear from my friends Pia Drugan and Melissa Hames at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy, who co-curated together Sam Feinstein, the early years in the Barbara Crawford galleries at SCH. So with that, I'm gonna mute myself. Pat, we're gonna mute you, and we're gonna unmute Pia and Melissa.
Yeah, you can say.
Hello and welcome to our beautiful Barbara Crawford Gallery. I am so enjoying this. Pat, I just love your stories, and it brings back all the readings and the research and what people have told me and passed on, so thank you for that. I am co-curating with Melissa, and I will let her start with the Barbara Crawford Gallery. I will mask up and step aside. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I am Melissa Hames, and Bill, thank you so much for inviting us tonight. It's so nice to see you, and it's so nice to see all the visitors here. I can't believe how many people are on here. And hey Pat, hi. So welcome to the Barbara Crawford Gallery at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. We're so excited to present Sam Feinstein, The Early Years. But we're especially excited because of the connection between Sam and Barbara Crawford, who our gallery is named after. Barbara and Sam met in the 1930s, as Pat said, at the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art, which is now UArts, by the way. And shortly after that, Sam became the art teacher here when it was just Chestnut Hill Academy. So for those of you who don't know, two schools merged into one, Chestnut Hill Academy and Springside School. We're now Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. But in the 30s, Sam came to work at CHA as an art teacher. And in 1942, he was conscripted into the Army, and he had also just married Barbara, and he had to leave, but he had to find his replacement at school. And so Barbara came in, and this is 1942, and she stayed here for nearly 50 years. And so this gallery was dedicated to her, I think either 1987 or 1990, somewhere around there. And we're so happy to have this show here because while the show features Sam and his early career, we've also sprinkled in Barbara Crawford's work as well because they painted around each other for their whole lives. And for me, that's a really exciting concept. They remained friends and painted together until 2003, and P.S., they both died within about 6 months of each other. And there's something really romantic and beautiful about that to me. So this show starts with Sam when he arrives in America in 1922. And like I said, we just sprinkle a little bit of Barbara along the way. And we can see how their journey towards abstraction evolves. And now Pia is going to talk about Sam's very early years, the 1930s. Here we go.
Yes, so 1930s, Sam was creating beautiful illustrations, fairy tale characters, like you see Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, and Little Red Riding Hood. He also painted a few Don Quixotes. And what you see here, it's the beginning of how powerful his use of color was and how bright it pops. If you look at that horse in Don Quixote, the whiteness of the horse really pops out to you and talks to you. It's also amazing when you get really close to these paintings, the details that he shows and he embraces. As Melissa pointed out, in 1942, war struck America and he had to enlist in the army. And so he did not want to fight. He did not want to go and destroy somebody else's life. So he pushed and pushed until he got into the pictorial side of things. And here you see on the right-hand side of your screen, the black and white images, his illustrations for the army. The first one is just magnificent. When you get close to that one, the whiteness pops. Learn to load your ambulance quickly and gently. Save time, save lives. You can just feel it. Those airplanes flying into you, you get up close and the pilot just pops out at you. He also won an award for one of his rest in pieces that made the medical soldier. So these are exquisite, and I think children would love to come up close and enjoy these for themselves. Melissa?
Hi again. So as we move around the gallery here at the Crawford Gallery, we've made this show chronological. And so we've moved you halfway through the show already. And now we're in the late 1940s. And we see how Barbara and Sam start to move away from representative work as they become influenced by new styles being introduced from Europe, like Cubism and especially German Expressionism. On the left is a Barbara Crawford painting called Waterfall. And to the right is a painting by Sam. And you can really start to see the role of geometry taking an important place here. There are sharper lines, there are bolder colors. And when Sam was a history teacher here in 1945, when he came back, he believed that the students' realization of art in everyday life was vital and necessary, and that their knowledge and appreciation of genuine works of art and being around genuine works of art is so enriching. So, and how do I know all that about Sam? Well, I have to say thank you to Pat, because the book that Pat wrote is how we learned all of this information. And when we met Pat 2 years ago, she gave us information about Sam that we had no idea about. So we're really super thankful to Pat, and especially with our new campus, we've just built a brand new building last year, and it's so beautiful. And it is called the McCausland campus, and it's where our lower school is. And Sam, oh, and these are some pictures of 2 of the paintings that are on loan or gifted to us. Okay, so do me a favor, Bill, and jump back one so I can talk about, nope, now forward. Okay, there, stay. Okay, so this is towards the end of our chronological exhibition here. And what you're looking at is on the 2 pieces on the right are right around late 1940s, very early 1950s. And as the work evolved, as Sam's work evolved, they continued, Sam and Barbara both continued to meet and collaborate with their contemporaries in the art world in Philadelphia and beyond, as Pat said, about working in New York and teaching in New York and on the Cape. When Sam did meet Hans Hofmann, Hans inspired him to experiment further and create this kind of new feeling, new energy, put this new energy into his work with creating more complexity with color and brushstrokes and straight lines. And at this point of his career, as Pat says in her book, Sam starts his pilgrimage into full abstraction. And I kind of love that concept because it really is a journey. So this is where we jump from the early years into Woodmere's exhibition called Group 55 and Midcentury Abstraction in Philadelphia. And then on the left of your screen, on the left of me in the gallery, is a painting called The Rising. And this was actually done in the 1970s. And we end this show with The Rising and with a painting by Barbara, again, same time frame, where they're using these really rich colors, these really bold strokes, these palette knife brush strokes. And that picture, that painting, The Rising, rolls us into the Woodmere's show about Sam called Immersive Abstraction. And I think we have one more slide.
Thank you, Melissa. One of the things that we challenge our viewers when they come visit the gallery is to just look at the walls and see whether you can pick up that one Barbara Crawford that's mixed in with that particular wall. I think that would be a fun exercise to do. What you're seeing now on your screen is Pat standing in front of Starry Night in our McCausland Lower School. She didn't gift us, she loaned us these 2 magnificent pieces as well as some other pieces. At the far end, you will see opposing elements. But she didn't just loan us these pieces, she actually came one day, one full-on day, and taught lower school, middle school, and upper school students everything about Sam Feinstein, the artist, how he painted, how he used color, how he used his palette, how he used the edges on his canvas, how light was so important, so that it brought out emotions in us. What do you see? What don't you see? The kids were just wonderful, wonderful audience and asked some fascinating questions. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Pat. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for introducing us, not only to your book, not only to your husband, but you've also introduced us to some of the alums that I had no idea were out there. You know, those alums that we reached out to and interviewed and shared with us these amazing stories of how Barbara and Sam changed their lives and how they continued painting after they left Chestnut Hill Academy or Springside, how they continued painting with Sam and Barbara throughout their lives. So thank you to those alums for sharing those stories that you can read about in our catalogs. Pat, you were amazing. You gave us everything we know. And I so hope that many of you come and join us. It's free in our little corner of the world. So come, join us, come visit. You've got the website there. Children have classes that they can take with their parents if they want to experience a little bit of this world. Thank you so much from SCH.
I want to say thank you to Pia and Melissa. That was wonderful. And it's truly inspiring to see these beautiful, large paintings bursting with color in the beautiful new McCausland Lower School building. It's a truly inspired choice. And, you know, of course, what we care about, you know, in a museum is the connection between art and people. And, you know, that's what I'm seeing in this wonderful photograph. So nice. I am going to move on here and bring us from the school to the museum, and I'm going to introduce Woodmere's two shows. Then, after just introducing them, I'm going to introduce Barbara Wallen, who is our guest curator at Woodmere. So, right now, I'm showing a view of Sam Feinstein, Immersive Abstraction. These are large paintings made by Sam. On the left, you see a painting from the 1950s. On the right, you see a painting from the 1990s. And there's a range of dates of these paintings, but they're chosen because they're large and they're made on a scale that reflects Sam's ambition to make paintings that would be truly experiential for viewers. This is an artist, and Pat, you said it so beautifully, this is an artist who believed that experiences with art were existential, that could be transformative in terms of the human spirit. And we wanted to set up this show so that that would be able to happen. And I'm showing here, this is a photograph I took of an unsuspecting visitor in our galleries. We have these, you know, little plastic ghost chairs that we wipe down immediately after somebody sits in them. However, you can see that we've set it up so that people will give themselves over to these paintings. And I'm showing, you know, the Untitled painting from the late 90s on the left. It's one of the real beauties, and it's a painting with this kind of brown cleft in the middle of this blue, orange, brown, purple, yellow environment. And it has this kind of experiential offering that it makes to our visitors. That is very much, to me, the experience that the immersive abstraction offers. You can see the space behind me. This is a photograph I took about 10 minutes before we started this Zoom call. We are getting ready to open our show on Saturday, and so you can see there's still pieces of paper on the floor, and the forklift jack is underneath the vitrine. That's going to have some of the Group 55 invitations and ephemera and graphic materials, but this is a show of 30 artists who came together in 30 artists who came together in various ways, some of them in 1955, some of them a little bit later, but were part of a conversation together about abstraction as a new language that they believed that better suited their time, and that the language of abstraction was a vocabulary that could tell the stories that mattered in their time. And these were emotional stories. These are emotional, it's called abstract expressionism because it's abstract, but it's expressionistic as well. And I think you feel that when you walk into the gallery. It's a very elegant show, and you can feel the conversation happening across the space when you enter the exhibition. It's a very exciting exhibition. One of the things that we talk about and think about a lot in culture more broadly is mid-century modern design. Is very hot kind of area, and collecting and home design. Well, these are the artists whose work goes with mid-century design in industrial design, in furniture, in graphic design. And so these are artists that I'm very excited to get to know. And these are interesting men and women, people who have had full lives, who have served in World War II in many cases. Pat described that Sam Feinstein served in World War II, so did Mitchell Wagman and Raymond Hendler. These are men that opened their own art galleries. Mitchell Wagman started a gallery in Philadelphia, and that's a photograph of him from the 1950s in his gallery, the Philadelphia Gallery, I believe it was called. And Raymond Hendler opened a gallery in Paris. So these are artists with deep, serious commitments and life experiences that makes me want to get to know them better as artists. And I'm showing on this slide a photograph of Hendler. You can see that behind him, something of a collage of paintings that have been juxtaposed next to each other, and maybe there's a painting leaning against the two behind it. But then next to it is actually the painting that's in the gallery, Vertical 1, number 9. And you can see how that appears in the photograph from the 1950s. This is a show that is very much about the history of Philadelphia's art and culture. I'm showing Charlie Bechtel's Untitled painting from the late 1950s, 1957 to 1958. It has biomorphic forms that to me are speaking to Marcel Duchamp, whose great masterpieces had just in the early 1950s been installed in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So these are artists who are having conversations with the broader conversations in the art of this city. And it was a time, and I'm showing a clip from the bulletin, Phila abstractionists on view. People didn't even know what to call abstraction at this time. And the dialogue, the editorial coverage of these artists' work was very much about people having to open their mind and wrap their heads around this new thing called abstraction. And it's, in terms of the cultural life of this city, this was a cutting edge at the time that was forcing people to rethink. And you can see that in the way that these artists are handled in the media more broadly. One thing I love about Group 55 is that it's interdisciplinary, and Pat mentioned earlier Malvina Tays, the dancer. You see her there from the 1930s, jumping up in Fairmount Park. Modern dance is all about walking and jumping and running and, breaking away from the traditions of formal dance. And Malvina Tays is a pioneer of modern dance in that sense, and is an important figure in the city, an important element in the Group 55 conversation, as was the great architect Louis Kahn, who was another close friend of Sam Feinstein's. And I'm showing the Trenton Jewish Community bathhouses over there in Trenton, and a photograph, just behind me. You might be able to see it on the wall. I'm not really sure. I don't want to move my computer, but a replica of Louis Kahn's mural from Trenton. And it's very, beautiful showstopper kind of an object designed by Louis Kahn, we have a view of Louis Kahn and his integration of visual art into architecture that comes into focus through this exhibition that I believe is very exciting. And I love the, Rick Ortwine, who's Woodmere's exhibition designer, put the Louis Kahn painting next to a Melville Price painting called Tornado. And the graphic elements of these two works really do speak to each other in a way that makes you understand them both better. And that's something that I always feel a good installation does, is it puts things together that strengthen each other. There are luscious these are 4 paintings of, 75 others that I could have chosen to put on a PowerPoint slide, but by Sanford Greenberg, Jane Piper, Abraham Hankins, and Francis Lackman. These are luscious, painterly works of art. There's a lot of interesting works to put yourself into, and a lot of luscious, beautifully painted works of art in the show. I have to mention my friend, the late Michael Ciliberti. Michael was a member of Group 55. He was a friend of mine here in Chestnut Hill. That's a work of Michael's on the left that's here in the show at Woodmere. And I will never forget when Michael came to me in my early years working at Woodmere. He told me about Group 55 and his participation in it, and he showed me a series of photographs. He had worked as a designer of department store windows, and he was describing this movement, Group 55, and the fact that he would incorporate the paintings from his colleague artists in his store windows. And I'm showing an example of a painting by Sam Feinstein at Blum's department store here in Philadelphia, which is to say that this truly was an art movement that had a visible presence in the city. They were taking every opportunity that they could to be in the public eye and to integrate with the art and life of the city. It has been an enormous pleasure to get to know the artist Sam Feinstein, who was the leader of Group 55, the organizer of it, and whose work has a vigor and an energy that, to me, makes him a real presence, an artist who left a mark on the city of Philadelphia, not only in terms of his legacy in his paintings and his art, which is beautiful, but also in the organizing that he did to bring other artists together in conversation, to engage with people and to touch people's lives with art. With that, I am going to introduce my friend Barbara Wallen, who is our guest curator of the show. Barbara gets a lot of the credit for how terrific the exhibition looks when you see it, and Barbara is going to describe more about her work and what she learned about Group 55.
Okay, I'm on. You can hear me? You don't see me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, okay. So it has been so much fun working on this show and collaborating with Pat Feinstein, Bill Valerio, and I am just dying to see the show in person because a lot of this has been done on COVID, on little blurry pictures and trying to appreciate them. And I'm just so glad the show is going to be open to the public so people can get in even in a distance. Somebody I just saw had a question about where did that name come, the Group 55, and it's because they first met in 1955, and these artists believed that their art was the art of now, today, that abstract art was the art of their time and of the future. In Philadelphia, of course, there was a long tradition of realism, and a lot of people were very skeptical about the value of abstract art, did not understand it if it didn't represent something. And so that was partly what this group was founded for. I had heard about Group 55 way back in the 1970s. I was doing my dissertation on Arthur B. Carles, and his students, Keita Broadhead and Jane Piper, had told me about how proud they were of being in Group 55 and they had heard people like Louis Kahn. They had had their paintings discussed before a large audience, but I never asked a lot of questions about it. And when I was working on, and we can see from these posters that they had exhibitions and they had forums. There were like two components to what they were doing. So next slide. Okay. So when I was working on Carl's, the best review I ever read about Carl's paintings was written by Sam Feinstein. I had no idea who Sam Feinstein was, could never find out anything about him, but I just always remembered that review. And when just by chance I met Pat at a conference and got to see his paintings, I could understand why he could appreciate Carl's, because Arthur B. Carl's was a colorist, and so was Sam Feinstein. And there was a lot of connections, go ahead, with Philadelphia and the Group 55 and Carl's. This painting, Carl's painting, is in the show, and it's a beautiful painting in the Woodmere Art Museum. Interestingly, Carl's lived right down the street from the Woodmere, right off Germantown Avenue. But until Bill Valerio became director, there was not one single Carl's work in the museum. Now there's a number of beautiful paintings. There was a big Carl's show in 2000, along with a show of the students, which was really good. But this painting was known by the some of the students. They really remembered it, and it was exhibited in the 50s, in 55 and 58 in Philadelphia. So this is something the artist would have known, and it's a, starts with a still life, but it sort of explodes into planes of colors and shapes, and it's basically an abstract painting. So Carl's, there's another connection, because we've talked about Hans Hofmann as being so important for Sam Feinstein. Carl's actually knew Hofmann. The lower picture on the right shows Carl's with a beard this is in 1934 with Hans Hofmann. They spent a summer together in Gloucester, and Carl's daughter, Mercedes Carl's Matter, who also later taught in Philadelphia. And Hofmann really admired Carl's and felt, and I think rightly so, he was a precursor for abstract expressionism. Carl stopped painting in 1941, but he was just on the verge of moving into abstract expressionism. And Carl's respected Hofmann, in fact, suggested to his students like Jane Piper that they go and study with Hofmann. So above that is Hofmann with Sam Feinstein and his son Sasha. So there's a lot of interconnections here that really interested me, and doing the research for the show has been like doing a big jigsaw puzzle, trying to find little pieces, fit them together. Started with this on Pat about 2 years ago. Sam Feinstein thankfully saved all these papers and the posters and the minutes of the meetings. And the other artist, Ron Bechtel, also archived his materials. And Pat and her assistant Victoria, scanned every review from the newspaper. And so we put it all together, and to tell the story that nobody'd ever really known about how Group 55 happened. Okay, next. So it really was part, as people have said, part of the abstract expressionist movement, except that these artists didn't get written into the big stories of New York abstract expressionism. They knew the New York artists. Sam Feinstein exhibited them, Hendler exhibited them in Philadelphia. But you can see the comparisons, like this Kita Broadhead on the right from a peach orchard could be very easily compared with a Hans Hofmann painting. It's very much abstract expressionist. The one on the left, she's going into using more cubism and fauvism combined, with these wonderful, building this whole dramatic painting out of just planes of color. I mean, color was such a big important thing for all of these artists. Go ahead. So the Group 55 went along, had these very important forums. In fact, I forgot to tell you, the very first forum they were going to have at the Dubin Gallery, which was the host gallery, and they had 200 people turned away from the forum. They couldn't get in. So the next forums they had at the Free Library, which could hold hundreds of people. And they kept doing these, but in early 1957, some of the artists were not happy with the way that Sam Feinstein was he was really the leader and the spokesman for Group 55, and they had some problems with it. So Ron Bechtel then resigned, and some of the other artists with him, and they invited the artists to join his new group, which was, they ended up calling Philadelphia Abstract Artists. But it was all the same artists who were in Group 55. And I figured this is all part of this story. It's just like a branch flowing off. And these artists didn't want to do all the work, I think, of the forums, but they did want to exhibit. They wanted to discuss their work, and they ended up having 7 official Philadelphia abstract artists between 57 and 62. And a lot of the artists kept showing together all through the 60s. So the little picture at the top is Bechtel and his painting. You saw one of them that Bill showed you. This one is another one that we think is based on a still life, but not flowers and fruit. It's probably gears and machinery, because he was an engineer, an engineering consultant, very analytical. He would start as, rather than, very opposite to the way that Sam Feinstein painted, would be just putting a color and then putting another color and seeing what happened. It was all very much more intuitive, whereas Bechtel was planning his out and much more analytical. But both wonderful painters in their own way, so that you're going to enjoy seeing them in the show. Okay, so the important thing about Group 55 was they really educated people in Philadelphia about abstract painting and what it could mean, and really had wonderful forums with all these people from different fields, different professions, talking together. But I think that also the fact that a lot of these painters were teachers, and not just teachers then, but they continued teaching for decades. And they were really passing on the same fundamental ideas about what makes a painting good, what makes it interesting to their students. Jane Piper, for example, taught at the Philadelphia College of Art, now the University of the Arts. Doris Staffel taught there. Many of the other artists, like Francis Lockman, other ones were teaching at the Fleischer Art Memorial. And their students were teachers. So it's been passed on to generations. Bill Scott, wonderful current abstract artist, it was very close to Jane Piper and Keita Broadhead. And he and other artists in Philadelphia are continuing this wonderful tradition of beautiful abstract painting that keeps going on today. It's been really a pleasure to get to know a lot of these artists that I never knew anything about. And as I said, I'm just dying to see the show in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. It is such a fascinating story, Group 55 and Philadelphia abstract artists. And I have to say, you know, one of the things I love about the arts in Philadelphia is that this is a college town, Philadelphia, in the arts. We have so many great art schools. And the idea that there's this generational legacy, you know, from Carl's through, well, Hoffman and Carl's, through Feinstein and Keita Broadhead, Jane Piper, coming down to an artist who's practicing today and who's a teacher today, like Bill Scott, whose Garden Fireflies is a Woodmere favorite. You know, that's a, you know, we make note cards with that, and it sells out all the time. The idea that there's a story from generation to generation is, you know, a big part of what this museum is assembling as we tell the stories of Philadelphia's artists. So thank you so much, Barbara. I'm going to move along here and describe, and this is very much in closing, I'm going to describe some of the events that are coming up, and I hope you will join us. Here we are tonight at the online opening reception via Zoom. I hope you're enjoying this. Saturday night, Philly Jazz of the 1950s in honor of this. Adam Falk, whose photograph you see here, is an absolute star jazz pianist. To hear him play outside at Woodmere is going to be a spectacular experience. I hope you'll all come. We have other things coming up, including an art workshop at SCH Academy that we're doing together. We have a lecture on Louis Kahn and the visual arts by Izzy Kornblatt, who's contributed to the catalog, talking about Louis Kahn, his museum projects, and his domestic projects beginning in 1955 that bring visual art and architecture together. It's a fascinating view of Louis Kahn that I guarantee you did not know. And then Barbara is going to speak to us again and really bring us through this history and the puzzle that she's assembled. Again, that's on November 5th, a Zoom lecture. And of course, we're going to have scavenger hunts. And I encourage anybody who's on this Zoom meeting, if you would like sort of a Zoom gallery talk from me or any of our speakers, we are always glad to accommodate. We, under normal times, we offer tours in our galleries. Well, this is how we're doing it now, and it's what we thrive on. So please feel free to reach out to the museum and, let us know if you'd like, a personalized gallery Zoom experience, with any of these shows. It would be our pleasure. Woodmere has a podcast called Diving Board. There's a wonderful podcast episode we just finished this week where you can hear Sam Feinstein's own words together with Pat's, with Barbara, and Bill Scott also speaks to a great extent, looking back at these artists in the podcast episode. It helps us if you subscribe to our podcast. So please go to iTunes or SoundCloud, or you can go right to the front page of Woodmere's website. The podcasts are the fastest growing form of media in the United States and probably around the world. And it's amazing to me how our podcast series extends the life of our exhibitions. The next time you have a card journey, this is a good one. Videos on the, on our website, we have a video that gives a taste of the exhibition. Unlike the podcast, which is long form, deep intellectual conversation, the video tries to give a taste of the spirit and the color and the juice of the show. And we will be releasing a series of videos throughout the run of the show that are currently in production. This is the first time ever that Woodmere has not had a catalog available and ready on the opening day of a major show, but because of the pandemic, the real bottleneck for us was photography of art couldn't be done in time for us to be able to move the catalog forward through the pandemic. So the catalog will be available sometime in November. We'll have another Zoom party to celebrate the release of the catalog, and I look forward to that. There's a section of the show that my colleagues at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy worked on, and these were remembrances by alumni of the school who talk about what Sam Feinstein meant in their lives, what Barbara Crawford meant in their lives, and how these artists touched lives in concrete ways, which is what we see in the museum every day. But here it's, in black and white, how exposure to the arts opened a path forward for this group of people who describe it. And it's very, very moving. It's one of my favorite parts of the catalog. I must mention Sam Feinstein by Patricia Stark Feinstein, Pat's amazing book. I learned so much about Sam Feinstein for the first time through Pat's book, a major effort and publication that tells the story of Sam's career. And at SCH, there is also a publication, an independent publication that the school has put together that takes us through Sam Feinstein, the early years, and it's a beautiful book as well. So please don't miss that. The experience inside the galleries is quiet and safe. In the gallery that I'm in, I'm here alone, but the maximum capacity for the gallery, according to the city's social distance guidelines, 14 people can be in this space. We ask you to reserve tickets online. You can show up and we will of course accommodate you to the best of our abilities, but our weekends are selling out. So I urge people to buy tickets in advance. Of course, bring a mask, and you can see that we've spaced art such that groupings of art allow for people to enjoy them at 6 feet apart, as you can see in that photograph down below. And with that, I want to say thank you for being with us tonight. We are happy to take questions now from the question and answer stream, but also I just want to mention we are always trying to improve these, everything nowadays is an experiment, right? So this was our opening celebration of the exhibition. We hope you have enjoyed it, and we would love to get your feedback. What was easy? What was hard? What was good? What was bad? What did you like the most? We will be sending you a survey, and we're very grateful to every single person who takes the time to answer the survey. So with that, I'm going to ask Hildy Tao, Woodmere's Director of Education, to please unmute herself and let us know if there are any questions. And I know that Melissa and Pia, Barbara, Pat, and myself, Hildy, we are all glad to answer your questions.
So good evening. Thank you all. That was a wonderful presentation and a journey through all these artists. There were several questions that I find really interesting. One is, were there groups other than were there groups in other cities that were parallel to Group 55? And if so, was there communication between the groups?
Okay, I'll try to answer that. A lot of the Philadelphia artists went up to New York, and they knew the abstract expressionist artists, and the abstract expressionists had something they called the club, where they had panels, they had speakers. And I think that was kind of a role model for the Philadelphia artists. But it was different because in New York, those were just for the other artists, but they weren't for the public. And the Philadelphia artists had a much different goal, especially Sam Feinstein, opening these up and trying to get the wider public to understand about abstract art. So that was different. I don't know about groups like this in other cities. I don't know if anybody else does.
So I'll contribute also. Several of the artists did go to the club as guests of New York artists. One of the things that you might discover if you, the book 9th Street Women came out just this last year about the 4 or 5 major female abstract expressionists. But the club in New York was less welcoming to women. I think there was just one who was a member. And it's interesting to note that the Group 55 has so many women involved in it. Of course, Keita was very well known. She was older. She was very well known already. Jane Piper became very active. Ann Ting was always there and active, along with Barbara Crawford. They were very good friends, as were Lou Kahn and Sam. But Doris Staffel, I've already mentioned, so as a leader, as a moderator. So women were really given a major role in exhibiting and participating in the forums, and I think that was wonderful. So that is a great difference between that and the club in New York.
And also about the women, I meant to say this myself, when they started, they were almost half women in Group 55, and they had leadership roles, and as Pat mentioned, even moderated symposia, and they had solo exhibitions. The women had as many as the men did, which was really unusual, I think, for that time.
And I would add,
both Barbara and I discovered that there was less of a party, drinking, wild atmosphere in the Philadelphia group than there was in the New York group, which could really get out of hand almost. Sam would tell stories about some of the events at the club in New York because he was commuting back and forth, writing for the magazines and going to the club and then back to Philadelphia. And so he was very familiar with both areas.
one of the things that is so remarkable about the research that Barbara has done is to give shape to what is distinct about the arts as it took shape in Philadelphia. And I think that through Arthur Karls, through Hans Hofmann, and you can see it in these Sam Feinstein paintings that are on the screen now, color. I think that if you think about abstract expressionism in New York, color is not what jumps to your mind first. But I think after you've seen these exhibitions, color is what it is all about in Philadelphia. And I think it just has to do with the particular configuration of artists, teachers, interests, and how it is that this conversation evolved. And that's what the show is about. I think that, yes, there are abstract art movements in Chicago and Boston and New York, obviously, Philadelphia. What this show, I think, gives us is, you know, a sense of what's distinct in Philadelphia. And to me, that's really exciting.
Thank you. Actually, you've already answered one of the questions, which were women artists treated as equals in 55? So thank you for anticipating that question. Another question was about Sam's time in the service. Was he with the artists who made camouflage weapons for the Normandy invasion, was a question. And I know he worked in camouflage. You can address this.
Yeah, I know he worked in camouflage originally, and I have a wonderful little notebook that has a very elaborate kind of program on how you make that drab green. You know, how many hundreds of gallons of this compared to that or whatever. So he did that briefly, but he was bored with that very quickly, and I'm not sure. He went in 42. He served 3 years until 45. I'm not sure that he was still doing that, because fairly soon after he got it, he was lobbying to use his skills in a more productive way, as he said. And he ended up in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. He worked with other photographers. In fact, I think that's where he met Clarence John Laughlin, the famous surrealist photographer from New Orleans, who actually was brought to one of the early Group 55 meetings, introduced to them, and he had a show there at the I believe it was at the Dubin Gallery early on. So we worked with him and Charles Adams and a whole range of very interesting people. I think the catalog from Springside Chestnut Hill has a marvelous little picture of a group of army people sitting around doing a portrait of another, you know, soldier, you know, in their time off. But Sam ended up, most of the years, he worked as an illustrator for medical journals. And so there's many like that. I think the ambulance one is one of the medical journals. And then he did the posters, a whole series that were called Rest in Pieces. And that one won the award, was put on the I think it's the VE Day, the VJ Day, the medical soldier newspaper. So that's what he did most of the time. I doubt that he was still working camouflage for Normandy, but I can't say for sure.
I have to say something funny. He probably never knew that Arthur Carles painted camouflage in World War I on the ship.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. So just to an earlier question, Betsy has made a comment. There is a kindred spirit in an exhibition in Sacramento. Robert Duncan, Jess, and their circle. It is lovely to see more of the artists and their cross-pollination. So I don't know if those names are familiar to you. I mean, I know Robert Duncan, but something to the audience. Several people are asking about the connection between, the possible connection between Sam Feinstein and the Barnes Foundation, and specifically, do you think the educational programs of Group 55 were inspired at all by Albert Barnes' preference for having non-artists come see his collection, or Carl's non-artist students in his private classes?
Barbara, do you want to start with that?
You know,
About Carl's and Barnes?
I had never thought about that connection. I know Carl's stayed friends with Barnes, and he was the one that encouraged Barnes, or one of the people that encouraged Barnes to show his art in 1923 at the Pennsylvania Academy, art that he just bought in France with Modigliani and Soutine, which the press and the public reacted to as degenerate, and which made Barnes like pull away from the art world and keep a lot of the, you know, quite a few of the artists actually out, I think, of the Barnes, or the museum people out. I know one time Bechtel wrote that DeMazia, who was running the Barnes after Barnes died, heard his lecture and gave him a lifetime pass to come in. But I don't know that all the artists had that. I know Jane Piper was there, and one time she got kicked out, and you know why? You were only supposed to talk about art, and she mentioned to somebody she had a hair appointment, and she got thrown out. Yeah. So I don't know about that, but more about the connections there.
Yeah, Sam certainly admired what Barnes had done, and introduced me to Barnes, and I have his early hardback book, etc. And but I don't know how many artists were, if they didn't study with him, they weren't allowed to go in there. Really, it wasn't open until later. So it was. For Sam, he did admire Carl's enormously. He told a story about going to see a Carl's show once and walking into a gallery and seeing a man sitting on the floor in front of a Carl's painting. He walked over to see who it was, and it was Hans Hofmann sitting there looking at a Carl's. And I think that whole color tradition comes out of there, and of course it does relate back to Matisse and to many of the artists that Cezanne certainly, and the post-impressionists, the other artists that Barnes understood and presented in such a beautiful way in his collection. So there are connections everywhere there, but I don't know how direct they are from Barnes to Sam or to some of the other artists there.
Well, speaking of color, there's another question. If Sam and Hans Hofmann knew or had an affiliation with Joseph Albers, the great colorist and educator. I mean, Albers and Hofmann both came from Germany as well, so. Yes,
and of course Annie Albers too. And I don't know that there was a direct one, not that I'm familiar with, but I haven't read everything there is to know about Hofmann. Their work was certainly very, very different. Their philosophies were very, very different. I mean, both Sam and Sam, even before he started working with Hofmann, the harbor scenes that you'll see, believed in the process of exploration for forms as well as color, making forms out of color, and making them very personally expressive. And Albers is very intellectual. He's enormously subtle and sensitive, of course. But those of you should be familiar with his squares among square among square. Generally speaking, he did a whole series of that sort of thing and taught at Yale. But it was far more classical and intellectual approach, whereas Hofmann and Sam, too, were much more romantic. Sam, late in his life, became more, I think, classical and more thoughtful and careful in choosing each color to make each hue exactly right. And so there was more control later in his life. You'll see one called Nightscape that shows that, or even, some of the untitled ones. But they were exuberant in their life. They were exuberant in their expressions of art. And you would not say that about Albers. I think that's just a whole different range, although Albers was a great colorist, too, in his own way.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, Pat. I saw a movie of Joseph Albers, and he painted with a white shirt and a tie and nothing paint anywhere. It was very neat. So it doesn't sound like the exuberance of...
No, and very crisp, hard-edged forms, basically squares, one square inside a slightly larger, inside a slightly larger, each color so precise, or the hue, the tone, playing with tonal difference, lightness and darkness, and adjusting that as well as adjusting the hues. But of course, Sam did that also in his own way. He talks about this in The Cry, in this film that we have, that every color note is quite precisely thought about and considered. You couldn't change. He would make a comparison with Bach fugues. He says, you can't lift out a few little notes and put something else in there, like John Philip Sousa or something. Every note should be precise. And so as you look at Sam's paintings, it's fun to sort of crop out something. Do you miss it? Do you, block it with your hand? Does it need to be there? What is it doing? And how does it feel? And what happens when you change it? Every little thing is very precise, although it looks very free at the end, very spontaneous. And he wanted it to look fresh and alive.
I have a question that I would like to ask my friends at SCH, and that is, how are children reacting to the art? I mean, I'm guessing that there are some things that are very accessible, like Little Red Riding Hood and Aladdin, but I'm also thinking that, abstract art can be challenging, and I'm just wondering how the students are responding to the show.
So we're having a little debate over here about whether or not we tell the truth right now.
Oh.
Because actually the school, yeah, truth is very out of fashion these days. That's a direct quote from Steve, by the way. We just opened up our doors to our upper school students. No, we're not muted, I'm actually talking. We just opened up the doors to our upper school students this week. So on Monday and Tuesday, we had our 11th and 12th graders. On Wednesday and today, we had our 9th and 10th graders. And then tomorrow, all of the upper school students will be on campus. And where the gallery is located is a major thoroughfare for the upper school students. And then every other division, the lower school, middle school, they come in for specific events. So, so we can't really talk about students right now in this particular show, but what we can talk about is what we went through last year when Sam's work went up across the campuses, and the children were besides themselves to see so much color and so much excitement and so much energy in paintings that are hanging on the walls was such an incredible experience for them and for us too, because what are we doing if we're not teaching our children to appreciate art and music and creative writing and all of these important artistic endeavors? Okay, so if you look back on the last 6 months, like what did we turn to? What did we turn to while we were in quarantine? We turned to music, we turned to movies, we turned to drinks. We turned to drinks while we turned to the Woodmere, and we looked at Woodmere's amazing online galleries that you produced. So we were really looking to artists to help us. And when we had the children in last year with the new paintings, we were thrilled, and they were too. So we'll let you know in the next couple of weeks how the upper school students react to the show.
Just a few more questions. Pat, somebody wants to know what your favorite work of art is by Sam in the exhibitions. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, that's a tough one. I'm not sure that I do have a favorite. Every single one, and a couple of them have been recently cleaned and restored, which is just beautiful to see them. There's a golden one that's in the group 55 that we had restored just recently, and that was, I think we're going back to it perhaps. It's just magnificent, and to see it, we went to a wonderful gentleman named Luca Bonetti, who has trained as a conservator in New York City, and he took care of that thanks to Barbara's recommendation, and that was marvelous. This too, I have so many favorites, and whenever I sort of tire from the many challenges of doing all this, all I have to do is see one of the paintings, and I, just keep going. The large blue painting that I think Bill focused on at the end, on the end wall, is one I discovered. It was rolled up in Sam's studio after he died, and discovered it, and it blew me away. It always blows me away. It just unbelievable depth and richness, and I don't think you can see it online and get it at all, I must say. you know, I love the photography here is very good, and I love what's being done online, but there is nothing like the experience of seeing them in person. You just can't imagine. So interesting to see the girl just sitting there absorbed, because that is the way it is there. And I took it to Brooklyn and had a giant stretcher made. You know, I'm driving this thing out to Brooklyn. That was fun, you know, and getting lost and then getting it framed. And it was shown in one other place. It was shown up at the Cape Ann Museum a few years ago. I've done other shows trying to get Sam's work out so more people know about it, more people care about it. And he belongs in a lot more museums, of course.
So another question, was there an anti-capitalistic component of this manifestation of abstract expressionism in Philadelphia?
Well, that's quite a question. I think, I know there were like Anne Ting, for example, one time I found online, she was like in the House on Un-American Activities report or something. I mean, a lot of the artists, all kinds of artists were being, you know, accused of being communists or something. I don't know about this with this group, but I do know that I think Sam and also probably even Bechtel got really fed up as in the 60s, the art world became more commercial and it was more about making money, and the galleries were more commercial, and that's not what they were painting for. They were painting for something much more spiritual, meditative, and they just kept painting, and both of them painted the rest, you know, for decades and decades and the rest of their lives, but weren't selling their work.
Yeah, I can say that Sam became absolutely opposed to showing and selling, or selling in particular, for a very long time. And I even struggled with it a great deal after he died, whether to do that. But I knew I needed to have more people who had his work, who cared for his work, etc. But he one time said that that creativity is spirituality looking for a form. And he believed that creating was something everybody should do. It's psychic breathing. A studio is one of the students called it a spiritual gymnasium. You know, how one raises awareness and a sense of integrity as you work toward creating something more perfect than you are, is what Sam tried to do, he said. Create something that's more perfect than a human being is. And he didn't really believe in the commercialism of art. And he believes so strongly in education. I mean, this man taught classes in New York and Philadelphia, and he had a class in Princeton too. We did 5 classes a week for about 40 years, completely dedicated to his students and to their growth.
I have a funny story. This is about Keita Broadhead. I was involved with a 100th birthday show for her. And when I went to visit her before that, she said, "Oh, I hope I sell a lot of paintings." And I'm just thinking in my mind, you're 100 years old. Why do you even care? But, you know, the selling them was people appreciating them and wanting to have them. It wasn't the money. It was that being, you know, of her paintings being that much appreciated. But she did. She lived to be 101 and a half.
So I don't know how many more questions you'd like, but there's a new one that just came up, and there was an earlier comment about Raymond Hendler's gallery on Chestnut Street. And the question is, how much did the Hendler Gallery influence the art in Philadelphia and the artist's exposures?
Okay, so Hendler, Bill mentioned he was involved with a gallery in Paris, but he did have a gallery himself for 2 years in Philadelphia that was very important. He was showing some of the artists that were in Group 55 and bringing a lot of artists down from New York. So that was one of the first times that people in Philadelphia, without having to go up to New York, were seeing many of the abstract expressionist painters. And then he then later moved out of Philadelphia and then wasn't part of the group anymore, but he considered himself a co-organizer of Group 55.
And another question, and then we can start to wrap it up. Is there a gallery where one can purchase works from Group 55 and or Sam?
Well, I have had a gallery in Chicago that has shown Sam's work, and one a dealer in New York. And if you, there's a lot of his work. He has so many beautiful works from the 1950s. I think that was his most prolific period of time of painting. Later on, he would paint oftentimes over and over on a painting and work on a much longer period of time. But we have many gorgeous things from the 1950s, 3-foot by 4-foot oils mostly. And we have a website, samfeinstein.com. There's also a wonderful film, there's an excerpt. There's a film that was 40 minutes long, made by Paul Fitzgerald. It's such a treasure. It was made in 1986 when Sam had his only show, between 1960 and 2003 when he died. And that show was at the encouragement of his best friend who still hadn't seen his work, Harry Hall, who had a gallery there in the little town of Dennis. And so the show took place. A film was made in 1986. It's about 40 minutes long, and I've shown it. And I had somebody come out of a packed auditorium in Princeton once who said, "Now I understand abstraction." Wonderful. But the 10 minutes or 12 minutes we have as an excerpt. And some of that, Bill had beautifully selected some of Sam's words talking on that film and included in the podcast. So you really should listen to the podcast too. Anyway, those connections are listed on Sam's website, and I don't know about the others. You'd have to research their websites, I guess.
What I think in our research was some of these artists are in museums, but a lot of them aren't. A lot of them, the paintings are still in families, and maybe a gallery will get interested just because of this show.
Yeah. And somebody is actually asking a little bit about Sam's process. Did he turn his canvas as he painted?
Sometimes he did, yes. And in fact, there was one, near the end, I had to decide what's right side up, which is not always easy. No, really, it's absolutely true. And he made it a point of doing that with his classes too. A painting could have a specific way to work, but it might say something quite different in a different direction. And he might choose to show it in a different direction entirely, ultimately, when he completed it. So he did turn them off and on, even the big ones. He oftentimes painted on canvas that was he had gessoed completely and pinned, but it was not yet stretched, because he could roll it and move it back and forth between Cape Cod and New York. And so they weren't all stretched before he painted them, and he could layer them one on top of the other, which he did, just for storage sake, because you only have so much room ultimately. So yes, he did turn them. Mm-hmm. Yes.
And lastly, I just want to say somebody asked if this is being recorded, and yes, it is, and we will make it available on our website when we download it and take care of editing.
Mm-hmm.
So those are most of the questions. People are commenting that they really are enjoying this talk.
Mm-hmm.
Bill, you need to unmute.
Okay, we're live.
With that, I'd love to say thank you to Pia and Melissa and Steve, Barbara, Pat, Hildy, to everyone who's with us from home. Please come see all 3 exhibitions at Woodmere and at Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. These are very rewarding exhibition experiences, and tell your friends, and we hope to see you. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
And thank you to Bill and Woodmere, everyone at Woodmere, and to Pia and everyone at Chestnut Hill, Melissa, because it's such a joy to see Sam reintroduced, really, rediscovered by Philadelphia. He is a treasure, but you have rediscovered him, and I'm very grateful to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. We are honored. With that, I think I'm going to look for that little blue button that says leave and start closing up the gallery here. Thank you all and have a good night.
Thank you, Barbara. Barbara and Victoria, my Victoria Shoe. There's so many other people I should thank too, but I had to mention Barbara.
Yes.
Mhm.